Myth in Christianity. What is mythology? Myth uses symbols to express questions of reality. They use narratives to illustrate the origins of man and questions of evil and death. Alan Watts defines mythology as a complex of stories human beings regard as demonstrations of the inner meaning of the universe and of human life. Watts argues that the mythology in Christianity has been obscured and replaced by dogmatism and theology of historical truth. How do we approach mythology? Chapter 2 in our textbook talks about symbolic classification, the attempt to create webs of meaning through language and classifying categories. Myths are powerful. They are mythical elements in society and culture that are preserved through representations of imagery, oral narratives, and rituals. These become both philosophy and religious truth. By using the story form, myths can be easily interpreted and express personal relationships between humans and also between humans and God. Recurring themes of myth include creation, flood, the slaying of monsters, sibling rivalry, and the hero, and also paradise or an ideal world. Myth in the Old Testament contains religious faith rather than being a mythology. Biblical writers declare idolatry as a sin, yet call upon man to worship God. Creationism involves how the world began. Christian cosmology begins with the myth of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis. This marks the beginning of time and historical sequence. The narrative details how God created the world and its inhabitants over 7 days. Biblical cosmology, sort of the origins of the world, answers questions of origins and also purpose. Why do we look this way? In Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him. Male and female created he them. And also, what is our purpose? In Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. The story of Pandora is extremely similar to the story of Adam and Eve and how evil was released. According to Greek mythology, Pandora was the first human woman created by the gods Hephaestus and Athena. She was given seductive gifts that contain the evils of the world, and out of curiosity she opens a jar which unleashes evil unto mankind. So this is similar to Adam and Eve, who were created by God and disobey their creator and eat the forbidden fruit. The hero, the mythic hero archetype, is prevalent in a vast amount of ancient narratives and has been discussed at great length. Examples of this archetypal narrative include Aeneas, Arthur, Buddha, David, Gilgamesh, Hercules, Lohengrin, Moses, Odysseus and Oedipus, Perseus and Romulus. The outline of a self-sacrificing adventure usually includes the call to adventure, assistance, departure, uncertainty, crisis, and new life. So Jesus, in Luke 22:42, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. So on the Mount of Olives, Jesus shows this hesitation for one of the only times on his journey. This is a key function that humanizes the hero. The hero faces many troubles on his journey. Jesus was beaten, tortured, and killed, but miraculously rises again. The Tower of Babel is another narrative that explains the origin of language. So it's a biblical narrative. After a great flood, a united society migrates east to Shinar to build a great city and a tower tall enough to reach heaven. God sees the tower and confounds their language. In Genesis 11:7, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, and they may not understand one another's speech." This myth is thought to explain why people of the world speak many different languages. So this is what's called an etiology. An etiology, or origin myth, are explanations of a phenomenon. Etiologies are stories that illustrate the origin of a name, a ritual, a culture, or environmental feature, or another phenomenon. Narratives are used to illustrate things that can't be explained in a society's time period or the knowledge of that time. So there's a relation of myth to ritual, specifically in the Christian calendar, which serves to relive the acts of Christ and have people move in the motions of Christ. The annual holidays simulate the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We also have the flood myth. This is also known as the deluge myth. It's really common in mythology. This narrative describes a great flood created by a god or deity in an act of quote-unquote divine retribution. The flood myth motif is found among many cultures, as seen in examples here: Mesopotamian flood stories, Deucalion and Puria in Greek mythology, the Genesis flood narrative, Manu in Hinduism, Ganyu in Chinese mythology, Bergelmer in Norse mythology, and many other examples. The Greek underworld and hell are very analogous to each other. In Greek mythology, the underworld is where souls go to wander without purpose. It is the dark contrast to the bright Mount Olympus. This realm is beneath the depths of the earth and is invisible to the living. In Acts 27, "Because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, you will not let your Holy One see decay." And another example of hell in Proverbs 15:24, "The path of life leads upward for the prudent to keep them from going down to the realm of the dead." And here we have an example of mythology in visual arts. So mythology has transpired in artwork as well as literature. This is a work by Nicolas Poussin. He was a French painter who depicted scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a Roman poet whose narrative poem Metamorphoses spans 250 myths over 15 books. And here we have an example of Doctrine of Euphemerus. Euphemerus was a Greek philosopher from the late 300s BCE. He theorized that myths are actually exaggerated historical facts. He asserted that Zeus and other gods may have been actual figures from early history that inspired supernatural stories. Christians have used this argument to adapt mythology to the Christian world history. The foundation of cities is a common kind of myth that is also adopted by Christians. For example, in the 5th century, the city of Seleucia in Isauria was known as a center of Christian pilgrimage because it was the site of the tomb of Saint Thecla, and this saint was a mythical friend of Saint Paul. So myth also serves as a moral and philosophical doctrine. The story of Midas illustrates how money is not the source of happiness. Midas is awarded one wish by the gods, and he asks that everything he touched turns to gold. He's happy at first and turns trees into gold on the way back to the palace, but when he returns, he tries to eat a great feast, but the food turns to gold, and he discovers that he'll starve. He accidentally turns his daughter into gold as well when he gives her a hug when he gets back. Midas realizes that this wish is actually terrible, and he prays and tells the gods to take it back, and they tell him to go to a river. He gets into the river, and all the powers leave him and turn the river sands gold, which also this myth serves to explain why the gold is found in rivers, specifically in this area. We also have the affair of Venus and Mars in mythology, which serves as a moral doctrine. The affair of Venus and Mars is a story about adultery and how love affairs are morally wrong and will always be exposed to the gods. Venus is betrothed to Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, but she has an affair with Mars instead, and they have a daughter, Harmonia. Vulcan finds out and makes a metal mesh through which all of the gods of Olympus can see their actions. It's a story of sort of the expose of the adultery. And so in Christian mythology, in addition to the Hebrew Bible, writers such as John Milton, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Madeleine L'Engle, and George MacDonald have also been attributed to Christian mythology, sort of creating the mythology of the Christian religion. And we have Alan Watts, who just wants to ask the question whether any of these images or myths still make sense to us in this 20th century when we have a view of the world so powerfully shaped by Western science.